China's Xi Jinping has made it clear Taiwan will be reunified with the mainland, even if it means it must happen at gunpoint. Meanwhile, America's President Joe Biden has vowed that America will defend Taiwan from invasion. The die has been cast for a showdown in the Pacific, and in what might be the fastest, most brutal, and most technologically advanced war to date, it's both nations' navies who will be doing the bulk of the fighting. So, who's really better, the Chinese or American Navy? China's naval expansion has been explosive and as miraculous as its economic expansion in the late 20th and early 21st century. Reeling from its humiliation during the Third Taiwan Strait crisis in the 90s, when the U.S. sailed a carrier strike group through the Taiwan Strait in response to Chinese missiles launched over Taiwan, China was determined to push the U.S. Navy off its shores for good. In 2012, Chinese President Hu Jintao called for China to become a maritime power so it could safeguard its own interests. Just 11 years later, China has overtaken the U.S. as the world's largest navy, and a significant number of its ships are better equipped than America's. In 1996, the Chinese Navy had only 57 destroyers and frigates, and only 3 of those ships carried air defense missiles, leaving them completely vulnerable to anti-ship missile attack. Of its 80 attack submarines, 3/4 of them were Soviet Rome class, which entered service in 1950. But by 2015, China had already surpassed the U.S. Navy in size, with the DoD placing the Chinese Navy at 355 ships and submarines in 2021. That same year, the U.S. Navy had only 296 ships. When it comes to shipbuilding, China is leaving the U.S. in the dust. Between 2017 and 2019, China put more ships in the sea than India, Japan, Australia, France, and the UK combined. In 2021, Vice Admiral Kai-Achim Schonbach stated that the Chinese Navy was adding the equivalent of the entire French Navy to its inventory every 4 years. That same year, the U.S. Navy commissioned 7 vessels. China, meanwhile, commissioned 28. By 2030, it's estimated that China could have as many as 425 combat vessels. By comparison, the U.S. Navy is predicted to have only 309 combat vessels active. However, this is assuming that the People's Liberation Army Navy continues to have its budget expanded indefinitely, something that is extremely unlikely. After years of increasing defense spending, China is finally applying the brakes, and a number of brewing economic troubles for China could end up taking a significant bite out of the plan's shipbuilding budget. However, the U.S. should not expect budget woes to significantly decrease the size of the Chinese Navy, as the plan is China's top funding priority at the moment as it seeks to hurl the U.S. out of the Pacific. Numbers aren't everything either. While China has many more ships than the U.S. Navy, the American Navy is still greater by both tonnage and battle force missiles, or a count of how many missiles each fleet can bring to the fight. In 2019, the U.S. had more than double the number of battle force missiles versus China, and 4 years later that figure was shrunk, but the U.S. still retains a significant advantage, and by 2030 it's expected America will still have at least 25% of an advantage in battle force missiles. This is largely due to the disparity in the composition of each nation's fleets. China has a significant number of small vessels such as frigates and corvettes, with 43 frigates and 72 corvettes. While these ships can carry deadly anti-ship missiles, they do so in far fewer numbers than larger ships such as destroyers and cruisers. They also lack advanced radars and other equipment that their bigger cousins have, in exchange for the ability to operate quickly along coastal areas, a requirement that China has great need for. However, the U.S. Navy has a greater requirement for projecting large amounts of firepower far from its own shores, meaning a focus on larger destroyers and missile cruisers. The U.S., for instance, has nearly twice the number of destroyers as China, with 92 versus China's 50. Where it really matters, though, and where the U.S. is set to keep the advantage even to 2030 and beyond, is in aircraft carriers. Currently, the U.S. operates 11 aircraft carriers and 9 smaller amphibious assault carriers versus China's 2 operational aircraft carriers and 3 light carriers. America's carriers can put more aircraft into the sky than most nations' entire air forces, and this matters a great deal as the aircraft remains the dominant naval weapon in service today. America's carriers are also bigger and more capable, with far more mature air platforms such as the F-18 and F-35 versus China. And yet, China's shipbuilding spree means that it has the advantage of fielding more advanced ships than the U.S., making use of new radars and sensors that U.S. ships must either wait for, refit for, or will never get until they're completely replaced by a brand new ship. There's a big advantage to building a navy from scratch, while the U.S. has to make do with the same ships it's had for as much as 40 years. This could lead to a significant upset in the brawl in the Pacific, but how does each nation's ships stack up against the other? When it comes to aircraft carriers, China is not only dwarfed in size but also in capabilities. Its Type 001 and 002 carriers, The Liaoning and Shandong are all former Soviet Kuznetsov-class carriers, with the Liaoning originally purchased from Russia so that China could begin training on carrier operations. China does have a modern carrier in development right now, the Type 003, but that ship won't be operational for years yet. Each of these carriers is equipped with 44 total aircraft, including 32 J-15 Flying Sharks, 8 Shanghe transport helicopters, and 4 Harbin anti-submarine warfare helicopters. The ship is also equipped with 3 Sea-Whiz stations and 3 short-range air defense missile cells, each holding 18 missiles. This allows the carrier to put up a last-ditch defense against incoming anti-ship missiles, though its primary protection is its escort fleet and aircraft. But China's current carriers have a few problems. The J-15 is China's first attempt at building a carrier fighter, and this off-brand Sukhoi fighter has a host of problems. Originally reverse-engineered from a Su-33 prototype purchased from Ukraine in 2001, China has yet to address key problems in the fighter's design. Its engines are very underpowered, which limits how much ordnance a J-15 could bring to the fight, a limitation that exists on top of that imposed by the Type 001 and Type 002 ski ramp design, which forces fighters to sacrifice either ordnance or fuel. China has historically always had troubles designing modern jet engines, and these troubles persist to this day. During testing, China lost 4 J-15s to crashes believed to be caused by mechanical troubles in the aircraft's engines. Adding to the J-15's troubles is the fact that it is one of the heaviest carrier fighters in the world, weighing in at a whopping 60,000 pounds. This is in comparison to the US's F-18 Super Hornet, coming in at a svelte 32,000 pounds and enjoying the benefit of much more powerful engines. Without going on a diet or developing far more powerful engines, China's small fleet of J-15s is best left on shore-based airfields rather than going to sea in what will inevitably be a losing war against US carrier fighters. China, however, is not resting on its laurels and is looking to develop a true 5th-generation carrier-based plane, a dicey proposition for a nation that's yet to master a conventional carrier fighter. The U.S. Navy currently operates 11 aircraft carriers, with 4 more carriers on order to 2032. America's current carrier fleet is composed of 10 Nimitz-class carriers, with the newest addition being the USS Gerald R. Ford, lead ship to the new Ford-class carriers. Unlike China's carrier fleet, every one of America's carriers are super carriers, with over double the aircraft. Nuclear carriers. America's fleet has the advantage of nuclear propulsion, which allows its ships to stay out at sea indefinitely. It also makes American carriers faster than conventional carriers, with a top speed that's classified but in excess of 30 knots. It's well known that at full power, a big U.S. supercarrier can outrun even its own escorts. This is a significant capability, given that a U.S. carrier's biggest enemy is China's vast inventory of anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from mainland China, greatly increasing the search radius of an incoming ballistic missile on a terminal descent. Like Chinese carriers, America's supercarriers are equipped with short-range air defenses to knock incoming missiles out of the sky, but also boast torpedo countermeasures. Its surface ship torpedo defense system was designed to directly attack incoming torpedoes, specifically those designed to home in on a ship's wake and thus immune to decoys. However, reliability issues have forced the removal of the system from 5 carriers that it was already installed on. While the system worked, its various components were unreliable, and now the Navy's looking to build on lessons learned to field a new active protection anti-torpedo system. Its most potent weapon, though, is its air wing. While acting as a mobile transport, each supercarrier can accommodate up to 130 F-18 Hornets. But in battle configuration, carriers typically carry 64 combat aircraft. Typically, this consists of 34 to 48 F-18s and 4 to 6 EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare. However, increasingly, the Navy is adopting the F-35C, or carrier variant, of America's most numerous stealth fighter. The F-35 is nothing short of a game-changer, and China's naval air forces have nothing to match. However, just because the U.S. can bring more and more modern aircraft to the fight doesn't mean the U.S. has all the advantages. For one, China's AWACS platforms feature more powerful and more modern radars than the U.S.'s, which has lagged behind in acquiring more modern replacements for its aging AWACS air fleet. Once again, China has the advantage of building from scratch. But China also has the advantage in air-to-air missiles. Its J-15s might be hard-pressed to take off with an adequate combat loadout to truly challenge a U.S. naval air fleet, but the few that China can bring to the fight are all equipped with better missiles than anything the U.S. has to offer. The PL-15 has not only a greater range than America's AIM-120, estimates vary but are commonly accepted to be about a dozen miles, it's also faster than Western air-to-air missiles, even Britain's formidable Meteor. This allows Chinese aircraft to fire first against fourth-generation American aircraft from further away, making a fight between conventional US and Chinese aircraft a dicey proposition for American aviators. The US is striking back though. Outpaced by China during its focus on the War on Terror, the US now has no less than 6 new air-to-air missiles in development. Some of these are focused on replacing US short-range Sidewinder missiles, but the most likely candidate to replace America's long-range striking power is the AIM-260, which features a classified range believed to be in excess of 25% greater than China's PL-15. The AIM-260 is expected to enter procurement within the next year or so, eliminating the only advantage China currently enjoys in the sky over the US. American aircraft, however, pose another significant threat to the Chinese Navy, and that comes in the form of a new generation of anti-ship missiles. China leapfrogged the US with the development of the YJ-12 missile, an air-launched cruise missile that can be fitted with a warhead ranging from 450 to 1,100 pounds. The heavier warheads can be launched from China's fleet of bombers as well as its destroyers, while the lighter warhead can be used on China's fighter aircraft. Alone, the missile has a range of approximately 250 miles, and when launched from a fighter, that can mean China could strike as far away as nearly 1,000 miles. Moving at Mach 4 with sea-skimming capabilities, the YJ-12 only gives American defenses approximately 45 seconds to respond to an incoming attack, making the US ships very vulnerable to saturation attacks that overwhelm their air defenses. The US is striking back in 2 ways. First, it's slowly replacing its stockpile of Cold War Harpoon anti-ship missiles. These venerable weapons have a 488-pound warhead and a range of only about 75 nautical miles. Though latest block developments have increased that range to 120 nautical miles, further they travel at subsonic speeds, making the Harpoon a significant downgrade from the YJ-12. The US has responded to the YJ-12, as it so often does, with technological overkill. The Harpoon's replacement is the Long-Range Anti-Ship Missile, or LRASM, and is a generational leap ahead of the YJ-12. Its maximum range is classified, but believed to be around 230 nautical miles, with a 1,000-pound warhead. Unlike the YJ-12, the LRASM is subsonic, but that's not a flaw, it's a design feature, because the LRASM is not a normal anti-ship missile, it's a stealth anti-ship missile. Featuring some of the same materials used in US stealth airframes, the LRASM travels at subsonic speeds in order to control its thermal signature and relies on its stealth capabilities to significantly shorten engagement time for enemy air defenses. The missile's advanced AI also allows it to be fired into a midst of enemy ships, with the missile's sensors comparing each potential target with an onboard library to select the right ship to hit. It can even differentiate between military and civilian ships and prioritize high-value targets such as aircraft carriers or amphibious assault ships over picket ships placed ahead of an enemy fleet to draw in hostile fire and defend from missile attacks. Launched in swarms, the LRASM can also deconflict, ensuring that multiple missiles don't strike the same target if unnecessary to achieve a kill. For all its advantages though, the US military still has only a few hundred of these missiles, and will likely need many more to launch saturation attacks that guarantee kills on Chinese ships. If war were to break out today, the US would be doing the bulk of its fighting at a decisive anti-ship disadvantage. The second way the US is striking back against the YJ-12 though, is to simply stop them from being launched in the first place. The US military calls it Cooperative Engagement Capability, and it basically boils down to connecting shooters with observers across an entire battlespace. First dreamt up in the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in the early 1970s, it was originally called Battle Group Anti-Air Warfare Coordination, but advancements in technology would only make it possible to conduct the first realistic trials in 1990. By 1992, however, CEC became an official acquisitions program. CEC breaks down to simply allowing one observer to guide the weapon fired by another shooter to their target. It also allows US Navy ships and planes to cooperatively engage targets that only one partner might be able to see, bringing the total lethality of a deployed air wing or surface action group to bear on a target normally only able to be engaged by one platform. In a combat situation, the US Navy would utilize its F-35 or stealth drones to penetrate into enemy airspace. EA-18G Growlers would use their electronic attack capabilities to actively degrade enemy sensors, allowing the F-35s to get even closer to well-protected airspace. F-35s could then pass on weapons quality tracking data to loitering E-2D Hawkeye platforms, which would then relay that data to fourth-generation aircraft such as the F-18. This effectively allows non-stealthy aircraft to engage deep inside of denied airspace by using stealth platforms to guide their weapons to target. The Navy is actively working on further programs to enhance situational awareness deep inside of contested airspace. F-35s may be stealthy, but that stealth goes right out the window the moment one turns on its radar to look for targets. This is why the F-35 has excellent passive sensors, but those severely limit the range at which they can independently track and identify enemy targets. Disposable drones and other tools are in development to solve this problem, and it's not just aircraft that can be brought into the kill chain, but ground or sea-based platforms as well. This would effectively deny China the ability to fly anti-ship aircraft within launch range of U.S. ships, negating the air-launched anti-ship missile threat. Up next, we have the two sides opposing destroyer fleets. China's latest destroyer, the Type 055, is a significant improvement over America's own ships by virtue of being a more modern design. However, the Type 55 is characterized as a cruiser by the U.S. Navy, given its larger size and capability to carry flag officers on board. Thus, it's better compared to the U.S.'s Ticonderoga-class cruisers than its Arleigh Burke destroyers. The Type 55 displaces 11,000 tons versus a Ticonderoga's 9,600 tons, giving it a significant mass advantage, and mass matters when anti-ship missiles are taken into consideration. However, all that extra mass also comes in the form of greater capabilities. The Type 55 has a max speed of 30 knots, making it slightly slower than a Ticonderoga at 32.5 knots. Not surprising given the significant mass difference between the two hulls. The Chinese cruiser also has a smaller range than its U.S. equivalent, with a range of about 5,000 nautical miles versus a Ticonderoga's 6,000 nautical miles. This is of little concern though, since China currently faces a war in its immediate neighborhood, while the U.S. must always fight the tyranny of distance and send ships far from its friendly shores. The U.S. has traditionally had an advantage in radar technology, but China's new Type 346B radars offer comparable capabilities to U.S. radars. It's hard to make an accurate assessment of which ships will have better radar, though, given significant amounts of Chinese disinformation about its own radar capabilities. Often, the Chinese, as the Russians, will claim to have radars capable of spotting American stealth aircraft, and that's not a surprise. American stealth fighters are not optimized to defeat low-frequency radars used to detect and track planes at long range, but rather high-frequency radars used to provide accurate weapon lock. Only large platforms like the B-2 and B-21 Raider are designed to defeat both types of radar. China's Type 55 comes up short against America's Ticonderoga in missile count, with 112 missiles versus 122. However, the Type 55 packs the YJ-12 anti-ship missile, while a Ticonderoga still carries the Harpoon anti-ship missile, swinging the advantage back in China's favor. With the advantage of building from scratch, the Type 55 also enjoys significant signature reduction features, making it harder to detect via radar or infrared versus a Ticonderoga. While the Type 55 is not a true stealth ship such as the US's Zumwalt destroyer, every advantage matters in combat. As it stands, the Type 55 can engage a Ticonderoga from further away with deadlier missiles. Zumwalts, by the way, aren't even worth mentioning in this review, as it's unlikely they'd even see combat. With only 3 ships in the class, the current fleet is more of a test bed than a combat-capable force, and it, along with the littoral combat ship, is a lesson in poor procurement practices for the U.S. military. The U.S. does maintain the numbers advantage, though, with 17 Ticonderogas versus China's 9 Type 55s. However, China continues to build Type 55s, while America's shipyards struggle to keep up with Navy orders and the U.S.'s replacement for the Ticonderoga, the DDG-X program. In the meantime, aging Ticonderogas are being replaced by Flight 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers, and it's these destroyers who will be making up the bulk of the U.S. surface combat power against China's Navy. In this matchup, we have the Arleigh Burke versus China's Type 52D. Currently, America is in the midst of a Flight 3 modernization program for its Arleigh Burkes, featuring improved radar amongst other capabilities. The first of the U.S.'s Flight 3 Arleigh Burkes was completed in 2021, and work continues at a steady pace to modernize the rest of the fleet even as the U.S. looks to its DDG-X program to replace the entire class. Arleigh Burkes significantly outgunned their Type 52D opponents, weighing in at 9,500 tons in their Flight 3 configuration versus 7,500 tons. They also outmuscled the Type 52D with 96 total missile cells and 2 torpedo tubes versus the Type 52D's 64 missile cells. However, when accounting for short-range air defense missiles, the Type 52D packs an additional 24 missiles in the HQ-10 short-range air defense variety, closing the gap with an Arleigh Burke. For its part, the Arleigh Burke can quad-pack its RIM-162 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, which provides defense at medium ranges from incoming missiles and aircraft. Earlier Arleigh Burke models carry no helicopter, but Flights 2 and 3 models now carry 2 helicopters, which can be used for hunting down enemy submarines or conducting general reconnaissance, while the stretch variant of the Type 52D carrier carries 1 Harbin Z-20 helicopter. Pound for pound, the Arleigh Burke outmuscles the Type 52D opponent, as it's part of the reason the US still has significantly more firepower than the Chinese Navy despite having fewer ships. Now, we move under the waves, with the US fielding 68 submarines versus China's 78. However, once more, numbers are only part of the comparison, because there is little doubt that the US has the decisive advantage in undersea warfare. Comparing the two navies' submarines can be difficult, given the extreme secrecy concerning some of the most powerful weapons to cruise the oceans. China has historically lagged far behind all the major powers in submarine warfare, and it wasn't until the mid-90s that the nation began to build what could be considered modern submarines. Originally, it purchased 12 Russian submarines to add to its fleet, and undoubtedly to reverse engineer, while adding 30 conventional submarines of the Sun and Yuan class, with a further 25 Yuan-class boats to enter service by 2025. While all of America's submarines are nuclear-powered, only 12 of China's are: 2 Shang-1, 4 Shang-2, and 6 Jin-class subs, with the Jin-class being China's first sea-based nuclear deterrent and armed with nuclear ballistic missiles. Nuclear power doesn't necessarily mean that the US fleet is better than China's, as nuke boats are notoriously noisy and difficult to silence, something that the US has spent untold billions and decades of research into solving. Given that the US Navy must fight far from home, conventional powered submarines are simply not an option, while China enjoys the benefit of fighting close to friendly ports. Thus, it has less of a need for long-endurance nuclear subs. However, as China looks past throwing the US out of the Pacific and looks to becoming a global power, it is increasingly interested in further developing its nuclear submarines. US submarines are more than capable of engaging surface ships, but America's subfleet is heavily focused on finding and eliminating rival submarines. China, meanwhile, has historically looked to its submarines to be part of a surface strike force, and only recently has it looked to change its submarine doctrine to be more in line with America's. This means that while their stealth is steadily improving, American Los Angeles and now Virginia-class submarines remain significantly ahead of their Chinese counterparts. However, China is well aware of this, and while it tries to close the technological gap under the waves, it seems more likely that China will focus on numbers rather than quality. In what's been called an undersea flood, China may simply opt to flood regional waters with a large number of submarines, seriously complicating the US submarine fleet's efforts to destroy the Chinese surface fleet. The greatest threat to the US subfleet, though, is that in order to simply maintain the current fleet while retiring aging vessels, America must build 2 new submarines every year. Yet the US is far behind this quota and is struggling to complete 1 new submarine a year. Estimates by the US Navy state it'll take at least until 2028 for US shipbuilders to produce 2 Virginia-class boats a year, while China is actively expanding its own submarine production capabilities. Like in so many areas, China is simply outproducing the US, and even if some of its components are less advanced than the US's, numbers matter a great deal, especially when the US must face China on unequal terms, because while China's concerns are regional, the US Navy has global security commitments that it simply can't abandon even in case of a full-scale war against China. And this is America's greatest weakness as its Navy faces off against China's. Starting during the Obama presidency, the U.S. Pacific Fleet became the largest of its numerous fleets, but because of global security requirements, in any war the U.S. can still only bring to bear a portion of its navy against China, while China can throw the entire plan against the Pacific Fleet. To counter this numbers disparity, the U.S. Navy is looking to seriously augment its fleet with unmanned drone ships and submarines, but this program has run into various difficulties, including a lack of vision on what exactly these unmanned vessels should be. Should the U.S. be building unmanned arsenal ships whose sole duty is to follow fleets around and fire fast numbers of missiles, or should it acquire stealthy surface ships which can zip deeply into enemy waters and launch attacks against Chinese ships? A lack of direction is the U.S. Navy's biggest problem. While China's procurement efforts are laser-focused, the U.S. Navy has for 2 decades been adrift in its aims and goals. This has led to numerous disastrous acquisitions which have burned up significant capital and time, both things the U.S. Navy could not afford to lose. The littoral combat ship is one example, a disaster of a ship that is combat insurvivable and haunted by frequent breakdowns. And yet, the U.S. continues to acquire them at a cost of $650 million apiece because Congress refuses to cancel the program, despite the U.S. Navy retiring LCS hulls within years of acquisition. Navy officials have practically begged Congress to stop buying the ship, yet precious shipyard space and acquisition funds continue to be wasted because the LCS program provides jobs in key congressional districts. The Zumwalt-class destroyer is another famous disaster, pricing in at $4.4 billion. It was the costliest destroyer ever built by the U.S. Navy, and it is all but unusable in combat. When initially designed, the Zumwalt promised to be a cutting-edge next-generation ship that featured a very stealthy design with an advanced gun system which could fire conventional munitions with high precision hundreds of miles. Instead, as the Zumwalt's fancy new gun never truly materialized, the Navy was forced to cancel the entire Zumwalt program, skyrocketing the cost of its main guns and munition to $1 million a shot, promptly leading to its cancellation as well. All in all, the Zumwalt program is estimated to have cost the U.S. Navy $22 billion, and today the 3 surviving ships have no real combat role. With time and tens of billions of dollars wasted, the Navy has fallen behind its Chinese rival, but it does still retain key advantages which could prove decisive. First of all, the U.S. Navy is a combat-tested force. While it has seen no major surface action since 1944, it's involved in numerous combat engagements since then. The Chinese Navy's entire experience to date, meanwhile, consists of largely bullying other nations' fishing vessels off their own territorial waters. The U.S. also participates in routine large-scale exercises such as RIMPAC, which includes the ships of numerous other allied and partner nations. A culture of realistic training exercises that integrates combined arms operations gives the U.S. a training edge that China will struggle to match, given that its own training has historically been severely limited and overwhelmingly choreographed. It's only in recent years that China's begun to undergo realistic training, and only in the late 2010s did China integrate its military services under a joint command structure. America's second advantage is the one weapon it has that China cannot hope to match, and it's not a missile or a new airplane, rather it's U.S. allies. There is some debate as to which Pacific allies would join the U.S. in a fight against China, but the U.S. has various treaties and partnerships with numerous Pacific countries. Those countries, in turn, have their own partnerships or alliances with major powers, such as the UK. Given that U.S. ships and aircraft are based on nations such as Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and South Korea, China faces the prospect of either being attacked by American assets from all fronts or attacking these facilities directly in order to deny their use to America. This will undoubtedly, however, pull those host nations into the conflict, magnifying China's problems. Japan and Australia are almost certain to immediately join the fight against China, given that China represents a significant threat to both nations' own maritime security. Japan is an import nation, which relies on sea trade to import various amounts of materials and food that it needs to operate its economy and keep its people fed. Yet most of Japan's trade routes run right past Taiwan, giving China the ability to sever Japan's trade if it were to take the island back by force. This is unacceptable to Japan, and even now Japan has rewritten its pacifist constitution to allow it to acquire more offensive weapons with which to threaten Chinese ships, ports, and even inland air bases. America's global network of allies gives the U.S. the ultimate high ground, even if it is currently outmatched in terms of number and even individual weapon systems. But the U.S. has one final trump card to play against the Chinese Navy, a naval blockade that China is helpless to stop. From the Gulf of Oman or the Malacca Straits, U.S. ships can impose a naval blockade of China's oil imports. With 60% of its global trade coming in via sea and the overwhelming majority of its oil supply, this puts China in the unenviable position of having its trade jugular severed by the U.S. Navy in 2 different geographical choke points. This is the reason that China is currently working toward acquiring numerous aircraft carriers, yet for now the nation remains unable to challenge a U.S. naval blockade. Even in the foreseeable future, if China were to match the U.S. in number of supercarriers, America still has the advantage of numerous friends and allies, which all ring these strategic choke points and could threaten any Chinese fleet with land-based or airborne anti-ship missile systems. A war between the U.S. and Chinese navies would be bloody and costly, but one side would emerge the clear victor, and in any scenario, time favors a U.S. victory. Now go check out how a Swedish sub sank a U.S. carrier, or click this other video instead.